Hi there, and welcome on the journey to transform culture. I'm Steve, and I'll be your guide. Well, folks, I hope you're having a fantastic day and an even better week. Folks, if you need a trigger warning, here it is. I'm going to talk a little bit about grieving today. Well, a lot of it about grieving today. Grieving, an interesting thing about us human beings, right? We grieve. We grieve the loss, whether it be, loss of people who are close to us or not close to us who maybe lost their lives, or uh, relationships. When relationships end, there's a certain level of grieving, right? We may also grieve, things that are job changes, career changes. You're moving from one place to another. It may just be distance between family, friends, and prior associates or whatever, right? We grieve, typically human beings, we grieve often. We grieve a lot more than we realize we do. And for those who are empathetic, or highly empathic or empathetic, they grieve for other people, in their situation. My grandmother was a person who did this. She was often sorrowful about other people going through things. And while not always, not a bad thing to feel bad for others, it can also consume you, right? And that's the other thing about grief that we have to realize is that while it may be a necessary stage of getting over something, that some people don't get over things, right? They don't grieve properly, right? Whether it's the loss of a job or a relationship or whatever, if people are quickly diving into the next thing to distract themselves from grieving the last thing that maybe was a surprise, could have been a betrayal, could have been a surprise, could have been whatever, right? When they don't properly grieve, what do you think that they're bringing with them into the next endeavor, relationship, job, community they move to, right? All of it. Family they become a member of, right? However that works, right? They may be bringing a lot of those wounds, right? Because grieving, we're grieving what? A wound, right? Typically a loss, right? So if you haven't healed those wounds, then what? You're bringing your wounded self to a new situation. Now, we don't always have the luxury of not, having to, walk and chew gum at the same time. Sometimes we have to be grieving and healing, grieving to heal in the proper ways, right? And this is where I'd stop and say, hey, if you need to see a counselor or any professional to address these things, or clergy or any other, do so, right? Wise thing to do. But we do. Sometimes we have to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? And you may lose somebody that's close to you that's a friend, but you still have to go to work, right? You still have to function for your family, your friends, or whatever, right? Your community, the groups. If you're a leader in an organization, for example, right? Since, obviously we jump in talking about organizational culture. Well, what do you think? Do you think no grieving occurs in organizations? Oh, yes, it absolutely does. When people in the forming, storming, norming, and performing stages of team development, right? Some group dynamics. It isn't just those who say leave an organization who may grieve, right? They may grieve the fact that how they left the organization, or how they were escorted out unbeknownst to them to be laid off, whatever, right? Things occur like this at times. But it's not just those who have left who are grieving, it's those who are left behind who are grieving, right? It's the rest of the team that grieves. And it takes time because there are professional and sometimes personal friends that, friendships that develop in work environments, right? And so you've got this, we often couch turnover in the idea of, well, it's income loss and we got to train people up, the functionality of turnover. And yes, that's significant. But we don't often delve into the grieving aspects of losing team members, right? Losing people who are vital to your team and grieving their loss and, as they've moved on. And sometimes it's grieving the loss if they moved on to another opportunity, right? It isn't just from betrayals and manipulations and nefarious things, although it happens too, right? It can be from anything, any manner of loss, right? And so we have to be cognizant, folks, that you may be watching this video and not realize that you're grieving a loved one that's passed, and they may have passed decades ago. And you may have been carrying that with you your entire life's journey since. And it may have been affecting your relationships. It may be affecting your relationships with other family members, right? Other friends, right? Your community, how you operate or how you perform at work as well can be affected by being caught up, or that the grieving hasn't occurred, so the wounds are still there, right? You see this most overtly played out in the media when people are of notoriety, like we'll say actors and others, who are pulled over for maybe it might be for drugs or alcohol, but they may have, but then they're ultra belligerent with law enforcement for really no reason, right? They just start going bananas. Do you think that person is just going bananas to go to bananas? No, they're grieving something, right? We oftentimes don't reel that back and peel that onion in, is that they're grieving something. Most of the times when people are acting out in general, they're grieving something. But this something may have occurred to you decades ago, right? Could have been yesterday. It could have been 5 minutes ago, but it could be decades ago. And there are some folks whose whole personalities are wrapped up in the fact that they're real snarky and rude and kind of just abrasive. But if you were to peel it back, they didn't arrive here like that. At some point, they grieved or didn't grieve and didn't heal a wound. And so that wound now became a part of their personality, right? That wound became an obstruction to their personality. They may not realize it, but that wound is preventing them from growing healthy relationships, overcoming other things, getting along with people, right? In general, we often don't equate getting along with others due to the fact that people didn't grieve and heal wounds that they've had in their life, right? This is significant. And collectively as a humanity, or people of parts of cultures or countries and states and so on, do you think they don't grieve when certain negative things occur? They do. And what ends up happening is they act out a lot of times, right? Where does that energy go? Because there is a frustration, if there's a manipulation, a betrayal, and all these things. There's a frustration. Where do you think that energy goes? It might be go into what they say, right, and what they do, right? They might start saying all kinds of things, right? They may do all kinds of wild things too, and this is the thing we have to be cognizant of, is we're responsible for ourselves. If you're watching this video, you probably come from a country that has rules and laws, okay, that keep everybody safe, right? We understand this, and we want people to follow those basic guidelines, right, so that we're all safe. But how quickly the lid comes off things when people feel, when they have these wounds, right? These unhealed wounds, because they didn't take time to grieve and to understand what occurred and why something occurred. And then, and this is a big one, so that you can deliberately approach problem solving the situation for the future. It might be, hey, I got caught off guard by this. I need to learn some things about this so that I don't get caught off guard about this again, right? And so you do see this. You see this with a lot of self-help things now too, which is a fantastic thing. We want folks to be empowered to be problem solvers and to overcome challenges they have. But it's a slippery slope. If you didn't grieve appropriately, you didn't learn those lessons, you didn't assimilate, some of those into growth aspects, and then now you've weaponized your grief into something that you're striking out against others, right? You may have been robbed. I won't say robbed. You may have been taken advantage of at a store on a price or on a customer service issue. Let's call it that, okay? And from that point on, it wasn't that situation being dealt with appropriately. Now you're on the warpath with everybody or anybody to do with that organization, that store, etc. Right? See how that goes? You've just become, you've just weaponized your grief. You just weaponized your anger, right? Weaponized the situation. Now, there are times if something's unsafe and real tragic things occurred, we need to, and the reason why we need to grieve and we need to do it thoughtfully is because we need to turn around and do something about it. The whole reasons we have the airbags and the seat belts and all of that came from the fact that people deliberately, they suffered and then they deliberately worked to make sure that there were safety measures that were infused into, say, future automobiles, right? And this tracks with many things that you find in our culture that some today may not even understand. But there was a grieving that had to occur, and part of that grieving is growth, right? Part of the grieving is growth. If you're not growing, this is how you know if you didn't do enough grieving, is if you didn't grow. You didn't grow, learn, and elevate from that experience. If you didn't do that, you're weaponizing it. But here's the kicker. You may not be weaponizing it against others. You may be weaponizing it against yourself. So you got to ask yourself, when people are doing anything obsessive, is it just a reflection of that grief, right? If they're partying every day, if they're just doing everything to excess, right? They're damaging themselves. Their finances are terrible. They're running up debts, and they've got all kinds of issues that way. All the things. Maybe they have anger issues, whatever. Obsessive behavior. Walk it back. What didn't they grieve, in a healthy way that now has resulted in them essentially weaponizing their grief against themselves? And they may be weaponizing that same grief against themselves professionally too, because they may go into a new work arena, right? They may go into a new work environment and become and kind of self-sabotage themselves there. Because why? Because they didn't grieve and grow through that grief to now understand and learn lessons so that they can handle things differently. In some cases, this is what occurs, right? They didn't grow through it properly. Now, that isn't to say they're bad people. It is to say, though, that they didn't probably grow through their grief, right? They didn't probably grieve long enough or appropriately or deeply enough, or they didn't cover enough things. And this is why you really have to take time, right? Slow things down in the sense that don't overwhelm yourself if you're grieving something, so you can take the time to iron it out, figure it out, right, in a healthy way. Now, keep in mind, folks, people handle grief differently. You may have some people that don't eat, right? Some people that don't eat too much. There's always the too much or too little of everything in life. And that's generally where you see a lot of grief go, excesses of this and not enough of that. Excess here, and they don't take care of themselves enough there, whatever, right? You see a lot of these large swings in behavior. So understand it, because it might be that you're not recognizing people who are around you shoulder to shoulder in your family and friend groups, in your community, who have been grieving for years. It might be that a certain type of business that upheld the economy in the local small community left town. Do you think there isn't a grief there? There is a grief, right? There is a grief, because that was, part of livelihood, things that people, thrived on, raised families potentially over generations. There is grief. There is a grieving. And what do you see? A lot of sad, mopey faces, and a lot of, which totally understandable, right? But then you also see people take a turn and go down the wrong path. And this is why we want to handle these things in a healthy way, right? And part of that is understanding that. This is why it's so important to reach out to those professionals that can help you with these things, right? This conversation with friends and colleagues that we have is so helpful, I believe. And hopefully you can take this as kind of as an entryway to seeking out assistance if you have not grieved properly, in any aspect of life. And then understand that about people you are working with and around, because you may just being an ear to others may help that process. All right. And on that note, folks, we're going to wrap it up. Hope you're having a fantastic day. Remember to hit that good green domino 3 to 5 times a day or more to uplift, motivate, inspire, and just encourage one another. When you do this, not only are you helping to improve and transform culture, but you're transforming your own life. But don't forget, you can't transform anything on the outside if you're not willing to transform on the inside. It's so important. All right, folks, have a fantastic day. Hit like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, we'll talk to you later.